Ενώ στα αεροπλάνα είναι σαφές ότι ένα αεροπλάνο με 2 κινητήρες είναι πολύ πιο ασφαλές, στο χρηματοδοτικό τομέα είχαμε μόνο τις τράπεζες, αεροπλάνο με έναν κινητήρα. Εάν βάλουμε και ένα δεύτερο κινητήρα, αυτό της κεφαλαιαγοράς, μήπως τα πράγματα γίνουν πιο αποτελεσματικά και πιο ασφαλή. Ο κύριος Florian Denis, υψηλόβαθμος τέλεχος της Ευρωπαϊκής Επιτροπής, θα αναλύσει το θέμα της Ένωσης Κεφαλαιαγορών, αυτό το πολύ ενδιαφέρον και επίκαιρο ζήτημα, η πρωτοβουλία αυτή της Ευρωπαϊκής Ένωσης, η οποία έχει ιδιαίτερη αξία στην παρούσα συγκυρία και στην Ευρώπη και στην Ελλάδα. Στην Ελλάδα, διότι αφορά και τις μικρομεσαίες επιχειρήσεις, πώς η κεφαλαιαγορά μπορεί να παίξει ρόλο στη χρηματοδότηση των αναπτυξιακών πλάνων, αλλά και τη ρευστότητα, να υποστηρίξει τη ρευστότητα των επιχειρήσεων, ώστε οι πόροι να συγκεντρώνονται στις πιο αποτελεσματικές επενδυτικές προτάσεις, με ευκολία αντίστοιχη με αυτή που κάποιος τηλεφωνεί στην Αγγλία ή στη Γερμανία, με τον ίδιο ακριβώς εύκολο τρόπο, δεξί click buy, να μπορεί κάποιος να αγοράζει μετοχές και τίτλους από όλη την Ευρώπη. Ο κύριος Florian Denis.
Thank you for inviting me today. I'm very proud of being here and to be able to present the Capital Markets Union project here in Greece. Thank you very much for your presentation. I think that this study is very informative for the work that we are doing in the context of the Capital Markets Union project. So, the Capital Markets Union project is one of the biggest political projects of the current European Commission. The goal of the CMU project is to broaden the sources of financing for the EU corporates in Europe, and especially market-based financing. We are also trying to build a stronger equity culture in Europe to complement bank lending, to stimulate long-term finance for SMEs and for investment projects. And we are trying also to diversify the sources of financing for Europe in order to make the European economy more resilient. Why we are doing that? It's simple, because if you look at this graph, after the financial crisis in 2008, you can see that bank loans fell sharply. And if you look at the right part of this graph, you can see that market-based financing was more, there was a drop, but it was much more resilient compared to bank lending. So there is a strong case to develop those sources of financing in Europe in order to allow EU corporates to find funding even in difficult times. And that's why we are trying to build this project and this Capital Markets Union. We have a lot of very important to channel more private money into the real economy and into more, risky and more rewarding assets. So it's something which is very important for us. So if I can summarize the objective of the Capital Markets Union, I think that if you, at the end of my presentation, you keep in mind this graph, I think that I will have fulfilled my mission. That is to say that we have 3 main objectives. First of all is to widen the sources of corporate financing for EU corporates at each stage of their development. That is to say that we are working on all the sources of financing, not only public markets, but we are also looking at different sources of financing like crowdfunding, peer-to-peer lending, venture capital, private equity, public markets, IPOs for SMEs, but also corporate bonds. So we are looking at every sources of financing because we do think that if we want to have strong companies in the future, it's very important to allow them to find the financing they need in different stages of their development. Secondly, we want to create more opportunities for investors, retail investors and institutional investors. And this is very important, as I mentioned earlier, that we are trying to channel more money, more savings into more productive investment, because it's important that the European household can save money for the future, and they can have a return for their investment. And finally, what we want is to facilitate cross-border investment. Just to give you a few examples of what we are doing in the context of the Capital Markets Union project, we are working on the withholding tax, which can impede investment on a cross-border basis, for instance. We are working on post-market infrastructure, because sometimes there can be some mismatch in terms of post-market infrastructure among the different member states. We are also working on insolvency law regimes, which can be an impediment when somebody tries to invest cross-border inside the European Union. So let's have a look to the first objective, which is to have more sources of, more market-based sources of financing for EU companies. So as I mentioned, we are looking at all those different sources of financing, so not family resources or retained profits, but clearly the ones which are above. Peer-to-peer lending, business angels, crowdfunding. We are also looking at venture capital, private equity, private placement of debt. I should mention that. IPOs for SMEs and debt market. And we do think that if we can try to rebuild this funding escalator, we think that we can have champions, European champions in the future. What I would like to mention is that we have a very pragmatic approach. That means that the European Commission was criticized in the past because we legislate a lot at the European Commission. It's normal because we are a regulator and a political body, but for implementing the Capital Markets Union, we have decided to use different tools, which means that for each source of financing that you see on this table, we are not using the same tools. We are not proposing a piece of legislation. We are, for instance, for venture capital, we are putting money on the table. We are saying, okay, the problem is that venture capital is, the funds of venture capital are very small in Europe, half size of the US counterparts. So it's very small. The venture capital investment is concentrated in few member states. 90% are concentrated in 8 member states. So the idea is to make the funds of venture capital bigger. So that's why we would like to have a fund of venture capital at EU level, which will be able to provide money for VC funds across Europe and to make this source of financing grow. The second thing is that in some cases we think that legislation is not the right tool, and as a consequence the sharing of best practice is better. And for instance, it's what we are doing when I was mentioning the withholding tax, which can be an impediment. For the EU it's very difficult to propose a legislation on tax issues because it requires the unanimity in the Council. So it's complicated. So we do think that in this field of taxation, sometimes the best way to achieve our objective is to share the best practice across the member states and to agree on code of good conducts and these kind of things. If I move to the next slide, so you have some of the actions that we are currently implementing in order to widen the sources of market-based finance for companies. For venture capital, we are creating the VC Fund of Fund. As I mentioned, the European Commission is putting money on the table, 300 million euros. We hope that this amount will be matched by private investors. This fund will be managed by a private manager. We launched a call for application for managers to find and to select the manager last year, and it closed in January 2017, and we are in the process of selecting the private investor which will manage the VC fund of fund. We will also revise the European venture capital legislation. This legislation was not a great success at EU level, so we have decided to revise this legislation. Two main changes. The first one is to expand the list of eligible assets, and secondly to have to allow more managers to manage this kind of funds. So at the moment, this text was approved by the Council and in December 2016, and we hope that we will reach a final agreement by the two co-legislators before the end of 2017. On private placement, it's a good example of the new method that we are implementing. Private placement of debt, the situation is a little bit different because this way of financing is not very well developed across Europe. In fact, you have two big markets, the Schuldschein market in Germany and the Euro PP in France. And what we are trying to do is to identify through a study the best practice of this market and the main features of this market, and to see if those features are, it's possible to replicate these features into different member states, and or in the countries where a private placement market is not possible, it's not possible to create a private placement market, we are going to try to eliminate the barriers which can prevent companies from accessing the well-functioning and the already existing private placement market. So the study will be published in Q3 2017, and we hope that we will be able to make some recommendations to the member states in order to create more private placement market and to develop this source of financing across Europe. For the IPOs for SMEs, we identify some regulatory barriers and some best practices. I will come back to this topic later. We organized 2 workshops in Brussels, and I would like to take this opportunity to thank you, ATEX, for its involvement in those workshops, and in particular Nikolaos Porfioris, who is here and who participated actively in those workshops that we organized in Brussels. In order to develop market-based finance, we also proposed a modification of the prospectus directive in order to streamline public offers of securities, to make it easier for companies to raise capital through public offers of securities. There are some, very new and practical achievements in this text. In particular, we have created the EU growth prospectus for SMEs, which will be alleviated compared to the prospectus for SMEs, which is actually in place in the current legislation. We also look at secondary issuances to make them more easier for companies. So we reached an agreement by the co-legislator in December 2016. On the corporate bonds, the issue is a little bit different. As you know, there were great issuances of corporate bonds in the past years, And at the same time, there were some regulatory barriers in the EU legislations which led to a decrease in the inventories of market makers, making the liquidity of corporate bonds lower. So what we have done for the corporate bond markets, we have created an expert group, and this expert group will produce a report in 2017, and then the Commission will apply the recommendation of this expert group in order to improve the functioning of the corporate bond market. The debt equity bias, I think that it's very important. In the taxation, interest rates are deductible from the corporate tax base. It's not the case for when an issuer issue equity instruments. Equity is taxed 3 times: capital gains, tax on dividends, corporate tax. So what we are doing through this proposal is just to address this tax equity bias by giving issuers issuing equity instruments an equity allowance which will be deductible from their corporate tax base. So we proposed a text in November 2016. The negotiations are going to be complicated because in terms of taxation we need unanimity in the Council, but it's a very important element of the Capital Markets Union. So the goal of the Capital Markets Union is also to create more opportunities for investors. So one important element is to get more institutional investment in riskier assets, and that's why we have done different things at this stage. First of all, we have modified the Solvency II requirements. Solvency II is the prudential frameworks which apply to insurance companies. So we have modified the calibrations for insurance companies investing in infrastructure projects and in European long-term investment funds, which are a new type of funds at EU level, which was at least 70% of their assets are invested in infrastructure projects or in SMEs with a capitalization under 500 million euros. So it was the first achievement of the Capital Markets Union in April 2016. We are also examining the Solvency II calibrations for private debt and private equity. We are looking at tax incentives for venture capital. So we are in the process of exchanging the best practice at national level for tax incentive in venture capital in business angel. Because tax incentive is not enough. What is important is also the design of the tax incentives. We are also preparing a possible legislative proposal to create a personal pension product at EU level. So what is interesting with that is that we think that the personal pension product can create a pool of assets at EU level to be invested in long-term investment and especially in equity investment. And secondly, we think that the personal pension product is very important in order to create a financial literacy at EU level. Finally, we are also looking at the retail financial services and we have published an action plan in order to increase the participation of retail investors into financial markets. So I would like to mention the public markets for SMEs, which is a very important topic for us and very important topic for ATEX as well. And it will be a very important part of the revised action plan. We published the action plan in September 2015. So 18 months after the publication of the action plan, we have completed half of the measures, and we have put in motion all the measures included in the initial action plan. And now we are in the process of revising this action plan to take into account the new political context at EU level, notably the consequences of the UK referendum. And one of the important element of this revised action plan will be public markets for SMEs. We do think that it's an important element of the funding escalator that I described earlier. So, as you certainly know, MiFID II, so the Market in Financial Instrument Directive, has created a new category of trading venues, which are the SME gross markets. So it's defined as multilateral trading facilities, was 50% of the issuers are SMEs. The SMEs are defined as companies with a market capitalization under 200 million euros. So we hope that we would like to make this SME gross market concept a success. And we would like to develop public markets for SMEs. So currently at European level, you have different SME markets. So you can see the logos of some of them, and you have the alternative markets of the Hellenic Stock Exchange also. So, So what is the problem with public markets for SMEs at the moment? As you can see, after the financial crisis, there was a drop in terms of numbers of IPOs from SMEs. So it's a huge financial gap for SMEs. We consider at EU level that 9 billion euros per year is missing for the SMEs. Because the public markets do not provide sufficient money to them, and there is not enough IPOs from SMEs on those markets. And it's something which happens in Europe, but it's also the case in the US, because as you can see, it's the source of this graph is the OECD. And they compile information from the US stock markets and the European stock markets. So in 2015, we had in 2016 we had 151 IPOs on SME market across Europe. The issuers raised 2.3 billion euros. Even if there is an improvement compared to 2015, we should look at the figures very carefully, and notably the fact that many IPOs took place on AIM, the alternative investment market in the UK, in First North in the Nordics. So we have, the situation is not satisfactory, and it's very important to restore and to rebuild the SME markets. Because those SME markets present many advantages. They present advantages for issuers, less dependency on bank finance, higher investor-based diversification. The issuer can go back to the market and to do secondary issuances. An IPO is an opportunity to increase the brand recognition for suppliers and for customers. And the shares, when they are listed, can be used as an alternative to cash for acquisitions, for instance. Investors also can benefit from public markets for SMEs, because SME markets and SMEs, listed SMEs, present higher return, higher level of portfolio diversification. And those markets are also an exit opportunity for private equity investors. It's also an opportunity for stock exchanges, as the junior markets can act as a pipeline of promising companies that may graduate to the regulated market later. And finally, it's important for jobs creation. I have statistics from First North in the Nordics, and what is very interesting is to see that companies after the IPO increase their workforce by 25% compared to 10% only for private companies. So we have a strong case in order to rebuild those markets. It's very important for the funding escalator and for the European economy. So SME growth market is a concept and is also a regulatory concept, because we are trying to create a proportionate regime for the companies which will be listed on those markets. And we are trying to do so to alleviate the administrative burden on SMEs, and at the same time we want to keep a high level of investor protection on those markets, because I think that it was one of the conclusions of the article today, is that investor protection is very important if we want to attract more investors on those markets. So we are trying to create a real regulatory regime for those markets. I will not go in details because I think that it's quite burdensome because it's EU legislation. But as you can see, we are trying to create a real regulatory regime for those future SME growth markets. So what are the problems of SME markets? I think that if we try to summarize them, we can find three different problems and very basic problems. The first problem is that we have a lack of companies which are prepared for IPO. The second problem is that we have a lack of retail and institutional investors on those markets. And lastly, we have a problem of declining ecosystems surrounding the stock exchanges. When I'm saying that, when I'm mentioning the ecosystem, is the network of professionals which are specializing in SMEs, accountants, lawyers, brokers, investment banks, etc. I think that this is particularly true for SME brokers, because they are very important to support SMEs and to support SMEs to the IPO. And in general, they do not generate enough fees on those markets because the liquidity is low. Because they don't generate profits, they don't produce market research on SMEs. Because they don't produce market research on SMEs, there is no investor, and because there is no investor, there is no liquidity. So, I mean, it's a vicious circle, and this graph tries to summarize the problem of public markets for SMEs at the moment. So, yeah, so as I mentioned, lack of retail investors. If you look at the situation of public markets, you can see that direct investment for German investor, for instance, stands at 14% and 7%, direct and indirect and direct investment, versus 50% in the US. You have also a lack of institutional investors. For instance, 94% of European pension funds do not invest in SME shares. You have also a lack of foreign investors. So you have some potential best practice at national level, and it's important for the European Commission to share those best practices at EU level with the member states. For instance, in order to attract more retail investors, you can put in place some tax incentive. For instance, you have a very successful tax incentive in Sweden and in the UK. The investment saving account in the UK attracts more than 4.3 billion euros into the alternative investment markets. When you have a lack of institutional investors, you have also some potential best practice. I would like to mention, for instance, the listed funds investing in listed and unlisted SMEs, which are put in place by the ATHEX Stock Exchange, for instance. And lack of foreign investors, it's very important to have the right market infrastructure to attract foreign investors, and especially CCPs. I know that in Greece you have a CCP. It's not the case of many member states across the European Union. For the weak pipeline of SMEs, so you have a problem of education and the financial literacy of SME. Few companies which have the potential to access capital markets are aware of the pros and cons of listing, and they are insufficiently skilled to tap alternative sources of financing. Potential best practice is, for instance, the Elite program in the UK, which try to educate companies with a high potential, and they try to put the SMEs in contact with institutional investors at a very early stage in their development. And you have some programs like the Elite program across Europe, like the Venture Network program in Germany. The second problem which explains the weak pipeline of SMEs seeking a listing is the IPO cost. IPO cost can amount to 15% of the capital raised, because you have lawyer fees, accountant fees, you have broker fees, you have the underwriting fees by the bank, etc. So it's huge money. And after the IPO, you have also the compliance costs, which are very important. So you have some figures on the table. One potential best practice is the subsidies for IPO costs. In some member states, you have grants which are granted by the Polish government, for instance, or you have loans in Spain by the promotional bank in order to lower the cost of IPOs. You have also the problem of compliance with ongoing requirements. Sometimes the SMEs do not have the resources internally to comply with all the EU regulation because it's complicated, it's burdensome, it's considered as a red tape, and sometimes the fact that the SMEs cannot comply with all the EU regulation can undermine investor confidence in SME markets. So potential best practice is the role of authorized advisor and the control of those authorized advisors, which help SMEs with the burden of compliance. And also some exchanges have issued corporate governance code to help SMEs and especially to create investor confidence. So when I was talking about a declining ecosystem, the problem is first is the weak liquidity on SME markets. 93% of listed companies with a market capitalization under 1 billion euro only benefit from less than 7% of the liquidity. So it's a big problem. This low liquidity can deter investors from investing in SMEs, and brokers specialized in SMEs do not generate enough fees because of this low liquidity. So it's one of the biggest problems when you are talking about SME markets, it's this very low liquidity. So there are some potential best practice like the use of different trading models, the reduction of fees for market makers, the liquidity provision contracts, and some initiatives at EU level in order to have order routing system across exchanges. Another problem is the lack of investment of equity research on SMEs. I put a figure from Nasdaq OMX. 10% of the companies listed on the junior market are covered by financial analysis, so it's very low. So the problem is that investor and especially institutional investor do not invest in SMEs if there is no investment research, or it's more complicated for them to do so. So some exchanges have tried to find new solutions like research financed by the exchanges or reduction of fees for brokers which provide equity research on SMEs. But I mean, we know that if we want to have strong SME markets, it's not sufficient to have this exchange of best practices. And we know that the exchanges, and especially ATEX, go far beyond its mandate and try to find new solutions in order to have more IPOs and more SME IPOs. So we know that we have some problems in the EU regulation, and in the latest public consultation on CMU, we had some proposal from the stakeholders, notably the fact that we needed a more proportionate regulatory environment for SMEs seeking a listing, and notably the market abuse regulation was criticized. And a more proportionate regulatory regime for investment service provider, and notably some aspects of MiFID II was also criticized by the stakeholders. We have also the problem of the potential impact of MiFID II rules on the provision of research. You know that MiFID II is trying to unbundle the research provision from the trading fees. So at the moment, the equity research is subsidized by the trading commissions, and it will be not possible after the implementation of MiFID II. And some stakeholders think that this will have very bad consequences for the provisions of SME equity research. And finally, some stakeholders proposed direct involvement of public institutions like the European Investment Bank, the European Investment Fund, the national promotional banks, in order to invest in listed SMEs directly, in order to have anchor public investor to foster institutional investment in SME shares. So that was my conclusion. So in terms of revised action plan, you will have a new communication on the 30th of June, very quickly. And I hope that you will look at this document, because normally we will propose new actions, especially on public markets, which will be the core of this new communication. Thank you very much. Efaisto Poli.